Hey guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Hopefully you guys are all having an amazing day today. Here we are going to be doing our episode 2 of our Homelab series. With this, we will be exploring and I'll be showing you guys how to actually create a virtual machine template in vCenter from the ISO that we uploaded in our previous video. If you haven't seen the first episode, feel free to go check it out. I'll probably do some box thingy right over here. Go feel free to check it out. If I can't figure it out, my hands are just gonna be pointing into air. So we will figure it out at that point. But hopefully you guys enjoy. We will just be going through and walking through the steps. So if you have any questions, comments, feel free to slap it in the comment section here, and we can talk more about it, or I can make an FAQ later on. So awesome. Well, let's get started. So with this, bringing back up our vCenter. So, as you guys can recall, in our last video, we actually uploaded an ISO that was a CentOS 8 ISO. So, now we can actually create virtual machines from it. But the thing here that we want to actually do is actually create a virtual machine template. Essentially, that's creating the virtual machine and then creating a template from it. So, first off, we'll create a new virtual machine from that ISO. We'll name it like CentOS 8 Linux template. Name it something that makes sense, right? So we'll head in data center. We'll put it in our Homelab group. We will store it on the data store. So the data store is just where the storage is, essentially, at the end of the day. So in this case, we're gonna for all these series, I'm just gonna put it in my Dragon data store. All my other home VMs are in all the other places, but this one we'll just focus on the data store. And we'll just essentially keep going. So now we get to the point where we essentially pick our Linux distribution. Because I'm actually running an older version of vCenter. It actually doesn't show CentOS 8, as you can see. There's no 8. So the time when this vCenter was released, CentOS 7 was released out. So we're just going to do CentOS 7. But if you download a newer version of vCenter, and I probably should download a newer version, there should be a CentOS 8 option for the guest OS. So we'll just keep on going through. So for the most part, going through these steps here, we have essentially CPU. So this is like number of cores that you want associated with the machine. This will depend on what kind of hardware you're running on it, to really figure out what you want to put. In my case, I'm going to just do two CPUs and 4 gigs of RAM. That's usually kind of like my default. I also always do like 40 gigs for a hard drive space, because you never know when you might need the extra space. For the most part, you're probably not going to need that much. 16, in my opinion, is kind of a little bit low. 40 is a pretty sweet spot where you can still do stuff on it without having to worry about it filling out. The one thing to note here is you want to make sure it is thin provisioned instead of thick provisioned. So the difference here, and this is probably the biggest difference and thing you want to actually know, is if it's thick provisioned, it will essentially allocate the 40 gigs on that storage, and will just allocate it. So you can't, it essentially reserves, so you can't use, when you do storage provisioning, you can't go over, the max amount. But with thin provisioning, you essentially, for your storage, you essentially just only count what is actually being stored on the virtual machine. So say, for example, the 40 gig disk space that we allocate, we only use like 16. It will only show 16 gigs being used on our storage system, as opposed to 40 gigs being used, even if it's not actually being used. This works out well if, say, for example, you're going to have like a lot of, small virtual machines, but, you just want to kind of give it a little bit extra disk space, but you don't really have the extra disk space. But it's not going to fill up, so it's totally fine. So the problem with thin provision is you can easily over provision. So say, for example, you have like, 100 gig storage, and you create like 3 virtual machines at 40 gigs. So essentially, if all of them filled up, on those 3 virtual machines, you would have 120 gigs filled up. But because you only have 100 gigs, you maxed out. But in this case, we're not going to worry too much about it. But if you're worried about your storage system, I would highly recommend just do thin provisioning. Don't sweat it out too much. unless you're planning to really like fill it up with a lot of stuff. The VM network is the default network when you set up vCenter, so for the most part, you can just leave it as VM network, unless you create something that is different than VM network. Client device, so this is where we'll actually do data store ISO file, right? So this is where we'll be able to select our ISO file for the CentOS 8 stream. You want to also make sure it's connected. So when it powers on, you want to actually know it's actually connected. So essentially, that's kind of the main things that you need to worry about when you kind of get started here. You click next, you click finish. The virtual machine should create, shouldn't take that long. So here, now we have just a virtual machine. So we want to actually build, configure it, and then convert it to a template. So obviously, to build, you need to power it on. Once you power it on, you can click on here to get like the web console. From here, you can go through the build process, and I'll go through it for this whole stream with you guys. So essentially, we're going to install CentOS 8 stream. It shouldn't take too long. We'll probably fast forward the parts that are just like actually doing the installation because that might take some time, but it shouldn't take too long overall. So let's see how it goes. But if you've ever installed any Linux box previously, it's the exact same, guys. It's just going through the steps, setting password, setting network. Pretty simple. So we'll let this load. It should give us a pop-up screen here. For the installer, installation log files are stored. Yep. All right. So the nice part about this is there is kind of like a little bit of a GUI. For the most part, I'm going to put English. We're in also the United States. If you just decide you want to do a different language, you're more than welcome to, but we're going to stick in English. So we click continue. Loads. Okay, so the things that you will need to do by default here is go to installation disk setup, which is essentially you just leave everything automatic and just make sure, hey, you want to just use this disk, use a full disk. Yeah. We got it. That's totally fine. So software selection, we actually don't want a GUI. So in this case, I want to show you guys how you would actually do things in the terminal, because a GUI is great, but when you're setting up a server, you don't really need a GUI for a server unless you're running Windows. But for Linux, you really don't. So we're actually going to just do the minimal install. So just basic functionality, nothing, huge or anything, just your basic install, because we don't want any overhead. We don't want things to clutter up essentially with the server. You only really want to install what you need on the server. So we'll do the minimal install, which is kind of funny because the ISO was like 11.5 gigs, so like it includes like all the different types of installs, but really like the minimal install is like like a few gigs at most, if even. So we're just gonna do the minimal install. So we just do standard installation of CentOS, nothing fancy. And then you gotta set a root password here, right? If you don't set a root password, you essentially can't log in. So I'm gonna hope that it takes my keystrokes incorrectly, and yeah, so we'll do that. You can create a user for user creation, but as far as I'm concerned, I always just use the root user in this case because it's my home lab. I mean, there's no point in doing separate users, but for like a production environment, you want separate users because you don't want everyone to log in as root, because then you don't know who did what. So in that case, you will essentially get that. You can just hit begin installation, and it should start installing CentOS 8, CentOS Stream 8. I call it 8 Stream because I don't know. I always like the number first, but this will essentially go through, download the packages, configure all the basic stuff. Hopefully, I don't think it will take too long. Once it's all done, we reboot the system. It should just boot up from the operating system itself on local disk as opposed to through the CD. So this might take a little bit. So we're gonna fast forward this in the video, but I'll sit here right now and tough it out. All right, now that I've finished doing all the installation stuff, we can actually now reboot the system, and it will essentially disconnect the CD, which is essentially the ISO boot installation. It will load up the image into local disk, and we should get a command prompt once it's available. All right, so now you can see that essentially this is just a command prompt. There is nothing really fancy about it. You're probably like, oh man, what is Linux? This is what Linux is. This is what usually most people in production system support Linux is. We don't use a GUI. It's all just CLI based essentially at the end of the day. So by default, the local user is at root. And then the password that you created during the installation. So now you can see that we are actually logged in as root at localhost. So there's a few things to do that I want to do, because just want to just make sure everything's up to date. We got some things configured before we shut it down and create this as a template. So the first thing that I like to do is always make sure that the machine is fully up to date. So we'll run a yum update with the -y. So the -y is, okay. So let me take a step back. The first thing we need to do is actually configure the network. Because if you go here, you can see we have an interface, the ENS 192, but there's no IP associated with that, which is rough because you kind of need essentially network connection to make this work. So what we're going to do is configure the network first. Let's just configure network scripts. So in here, we're actually going to set this up, and I have to pull something else up off my other screen to make sure I get all the parameters right. Okay, so what we'll do here is set the boot pronto to none. Equals none. Leave everything else as default there. We will now add the IP address. So the thing with the IP address is you'll need to figure out in your home network, so what IP address that you want. So for the most part, we'll minimize that real quick. If you actually open your command prompt, you can go to do an IP config. So you can see that this computer that I'm on, I have a 192.168.1 address right here. So that's my IP address. Don't copy and paste this because you can't have overlapping IP addresses. But you can see that in this case, our default gateway is 1.1. So depending on how your home is set up or what router you use, it could be a 192.168.1.1, 0.1, or like a 172.16.1.1. You really won't really know until you do this, but you can essentially assume already knowing what the first three are, and then you need to figure out the last one. Most likely, most people's subnet is a class C, which means that this is the first class, second class, third class, where essentially if you have it like this, only the last number changes here. So essentially this last number can be 1 to 254. In this case, I don't know off the top of my head what IPs I have open, so an easy way to actually determine whether an IP is actually being used or not, in this case, and for the most part, you can log into your router or log into your firewall to figure out what is also being used, but I'm fairly confident I have the 1.30 range not being used, so you can see that there's no ping response when I'm at 1.30. So we're just going to use 1.30 in this case for our system. So we'll go back to the command prompt. We'll enter 192.168.1.30. We also need to do the prefix. So the prefix is equals to 24. So in this case, the prefix is based off of the subnet mask. So each one of these prefix is a /8. So for example, if this was 255.255.0.0, it would be a /16. If this was just a 255.0.0.0, it would be a /8. So since this is 255.255.255, it's 8 times 3, so it's a /24. That is just the simple quick math on how to do it without having to like really know the numbers. If you really want to know the numbers, I can actually create another YouTube videos. You can also put it in the comments if you want to know how the actual math works for actual subnetting. But in this case, I'm not going to go into the nitty gritty for that. But if you want to hear, let me know in the comments. So in this case, it's a /24 for the prefix. And then we will do the gateway. And the gateway is essentially just telling you where the traffic should go to be routed. So in this case, it should go to our firewall. And you can see that here, that any traffic that I essentially go to, it will always hit that firewall and go somewhere from there. Then we have, we can set up DNS too. So we'll set up DNS where it's essentially pointing to Google's DNS server. If you don't set up a DNS, by default, it will use whatever DNS is set on the gateway, in which case I also do have it pointing to Google's DNS. I personally prefer public DNSs like Cloudflare DNS 1.1.1.1 or Google DNS 8.8.8.8 or 8.8.8.4.4 because they are way better managed and supported than like using my upstream internet provider because they just provide internet. I don't trust them as much. But for the most part, if you want to just use Google's public DNS, you can just use 8.8.8.8. So with that, we will save it. Also, if you want a lesson in Vi/Vim, which are pretty much the exact same, one is just more lightweight than the other, let me know in the comments. That's how I'm editing all these files. I'm using Vi, which is an editor that comes with this Linux distribution. So it's an easy kind of editor to just edit files. But there is definitely a learning curve in regards to using it, because when I first started learning it, I was just like, oh my God, there's so much to learn. Okay, so now that we have that set up, we can restart the network, or maybe it's networking. Or oh damn, it's been a little bit. I don't know what the worst case, I don't know what the service is, but if you restart the whole box, it'll restart the service. So you could use like the reboot command. I personally actually use the init, which is more of a system command where it's actually like actual system. Oh, that's not the password. So in this case, when I did init 6, that's a reboot. If I do init 0, that's a actually shutdown. So that's just a little bit about commands. So if you want another video about commands, let me know about that too, because that wasn't one that I was planning to do. But if you're interested, let me know. Okay, so now there should be internet. So I should be able to like ping www.google.com or not. All right. What? Okay. Okay. Possibly. Oh my God. I need to Google this real quick. If down command. Oh, if down is not found. That's hilarious. Okay, so I usually don't run into... Networking issue is always the worst issue to deal with. So let's make sure the network is connected. Okay. Troubleshooting steps. Okay, so network's unreachable. Let's see, sysconfig network scripts. Yeah, so there's just this one. Let's make sure we didn't type anything weird in it. So we got gateway prefix, IP address, boot pronto none, none. The rest looks right. So why is it not connecting? That is a good question right now. So let's take a look here real quick. CentOS 8 setup static IP. So essentially, it should just do everything that I did. Yeah, so you got all those, and then it should show like this, but it doesn't because it shows up without the IP address, unfortunately, which means okay, maybe CentOS 8 restart network interface. Oh, it's called a network manager service. Restart manager.service. Okay. But it still doesn't give me the right IP address. Like it's hooked up. Okay, did I type anything in wrong? That's the question. Okay, so we got gateway, prefix. Yeah, that sounds IP IDDR. Oh. On boot. That might be another good thing to put. I think that's supposed to be yes. Okay, there we go. On boot needs to be yes, guys. So now you can see it actually says that there is an IP address. Now we could ping Google. Boom. Okay. That was a little bit of a detour, but now we should update the server because we want to make sure it is the latest version of the operating system, latest versions of the packages that it needs. So, you're not running a vulnerable version package. So yum update is the command. -y means yes to accept. And I'll do it without the -y, but essentially it will go out to the public mirrors, figure out all the packages that are currently installed and what can be updated. And in most cases, by a default install, it's not going to be like the latest packages. So you want to make sure that you always update it and do it frequently too. So in this case, the only thing that it actually found was it needed to upgrade the hostname package. So where it asks you, is this okay? The Y and N, that's what the -y would have answered. It would have just been like, yeah, this is okay. Don't need to even prompt me, right? Yes, that's the official summary. Okay, so next thing we want to do is actually set the host name of this because localhost really isn't a great host name. So what I'm going to do is set the host name. We'll actually name it CentOS 8 template. So you can't see the hostname actually changing until you re-log in. So now you can see that the login says CentOS 8 template instead of localhost. Okay, so now that it's updated, now that we changed the hostname, the few things that I like to do, especially for a Homelab, would not recommend it for a production environment, but for a Homelab, a few things you want to just disable or stop because it is kind of a pain to deal with when you're trying to troubleshoot because it's like another learning curve. So there's this thing called SE Linux, which is another kind of security aspect that is allowed to kind of, help make sure that, you're not doing something stupid. But in this case, it can be a little overbearing, especially if you're setting up a website or something that you need to actually like run more commands, more SE Linux commands to like enable certain ports or services to be able to run the machine. So it's actually very annoying. So for a, testing Homelab environment, what I recommend is instead of having it set to be enforcing, you set it to be permissive. So essentially this will allow it, so it will just print out the warnings instead of just blocking you from doing something. I've ran into a lot of issues where SE Linux just causes more pain than harm when you're trying to just build something and you're like, oh, this isn't working, but this is exactly how it should be done. And it's because SE Linux has like some kind of protocol on the back end that, some policy on the back end that's like, we don't allow this unless you explicitly allow it. And you're like, okay. So, but it takes forever to even find it. So what I usually recommend for a lab environment to put it into permissive. The other thing that I would recommend to also disable is the firewall. Now you're like, what? Disable the firewall? Also, lab environment. The reason why I say to disable the firewall is so that you don't have to mess with firewall rules in regards to like opening ports on the computer itself. That's going to be one of probably the biggest thing that you'll run into, where it's like, hey, my web application is running on port 80 or 443, and you try to connect on your computer to that, and it doesn't work. And you're like, why? And it's because the port isn't open either via SE Linux or the firewall. So, reiterating, for a Homelab situation, it is easier to not deal with that at this point until you kind of get used to, doing that stuff and understanding the rules. So what we're actually going to do is we're just going to disable the firewall also. In this case, how this works is systemctl is kind of like your services in like Microsoft, where it's like you can kind of like your application manager, like task manager type situation. So there's a few parameters that you can use with systemctl. For example, enable, disable, status, start, stop, and restart. So for enable and disable, that only pertains to on boot. So if you enable a service, it will be started on boot. But if you disable, it won't be. The start and stop are only for the current session. So in this case, we will just stop. So I've disabled the firewall, but the firewall, if you do a systemctl status, it is actually still enabled right now because the disable only means, hey, you don't start it on boot. So if I wanted to stop it right now without rebooting, I would actually do a stop, and you can see that it would be stopped now, or inactive/dead is what you would see it. So with that pretty much concludes what I would do on a machine to kind of get the base stuff, make sure it's updated, make sure a few things are turned off for a template. So what I have here is, now that we have all that configured, we will shut it down. So I will use the init0 command. I believe shutdown also works, but I like init because it's more universal. So we'll shut it down, init0, right? So you can see that this green bar that says it's online will turn offline now. So now you can see that it's offline. So now that you have a base build and you're like, I don't want to go through all that again, wait for that timing for it to all install all those packages and all that, you don't have to worry about that. The best part about having like vCenter is essentially you can make this into a template. So if you right click on the VM, you can convert to a template, and now it is marked as a template. So if you were to create a new virtual machine, deploy from a template, you can go to your data center and you can see that there is a CentOS 8 Linux template. As you can see, I have a few other templates because I like to play around with other operating systems. So I have CentOS 7, Oracle Linux 8, and things like that. But we're going to just focus on the CentOS 8 template. So essentially, what you can do now is go through this. You want to name it like virtual VM build 1. So going through this, you can see that you would still select the same thing. You would still look through all this. It will actually take the same parameters that you put in originally in here, so you can still configure it. So like say, hey, I need to set up a box that's actually like 16 gigs of RAM and like 8 cores. You can still update it, but by default this template will be 2 and 4 because that's what we originally set with 40 hard disk space and it's thin provisioning, and then the network and everything. So you can finish that and it will actually create a new virtual machine called VM build based off of that template. So that pretty much allows you to just clone a virtual machine template without having to go through the whole thing over and over again. So everything that we did is done now. We don't have to worry about needing to do that all over again for every single virtual machine we do. So that's the luxury of creating a virtual machine template. So with that essentially concludes this video on how to create a virtual machine template. In our next video, we'll start actually building out some servers and services to kind of give you a gist of how to get started, where to even start, like what should I even build first, because obviously you can't just build stuff and not kind of build like the prereqs, right? So we're gonna go through those in our next video here. But thank you for stopping by, guys. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, please slap a like, give me a comment, or subscribe to my YouTube channel. So awesome. Hope you guys have a great day. We'll see you guys later.